Okay, so Cucumber, as I said, has the best name for a testing tool ever. This one probably has the cutest mascot. The counterpart for Cucumber is Capybara. And if you've never seen a capybara, it is a very large aquatic rodent. It's about the size of a small dog. They're very docile, and until recently, you could see them at the San Francisco Zoo, but their capybara appears to have moved away. But what is Capybara? Capybara is a library that works in conjunction with Cucumber. It also works standalone, has many other uses, but Cucumber relies on it to essentially simulate the user by automating what a browser would do. So this is where we make the connection of a user story that says, when I follow or when I click on this link, what actually happens? Like, how do you turn that into a test? Capybara is able to create an HTTP request to any route in your app. It can submit forms. It can interact with UI elements on the form. It can receive pages, in other words, receive a response from the server. It can examine the content of the response, for example, an HTML page, and verify that certain elements or certain pieces of text do or do not occur on the page. So very roughly speaking, if it is something that a human user could do, it is something that Capybara can automate. Some things are easier to automate than others, but by and large, that's what Capybara does. So a very few methods that, a small sampling of the hundreds of methods that Capybara has, you can say visit and give it a URL. It will hit your app and try to hit that URL, and hopefully that corresponds to a route and actually does something. You could say click link. Capybara will look for a link whose text matches the string, and it will essentially submit the HTTP request as if the user had clicked on that link. And if you were going to ask, yes, things like cookies just sort of work. So if you do an initial request and it results in a cookie being sent back to the client, Capybara will correctly reuse that cookie on future requests. So the notion of a workflow where you're doing multiple things at once is easy to script. You can say fill in. Let's say you have an HTML form, and you can either refer to fields on that form by their label. If you remember, there's a label HTML element that can be associated with a field. So Capybara can look for the label element matching the string title, figure out which text field is associated with that label, enter some text into the field, and then sometime later on, you can click the form submit button. But if you're not using labels, or if you need to manipulate something on the page that is not otherwise identifiable by a text string, you can also use a CSS selector. Remember CSS from way back in the day? So here's a Capybara directive saying, look for a form element whose ID is form1, and inside that form, look for something called name field, and fill that in with whatever string. So Capybara is exceedingly powerful, and it's pretty good at figuring out what you want. You can select things from drop-down menus, and in the future, we'll talk about some of the JavaScript capabilities that it has. So just to sort of zoom out to the big picture, like how does this work? When you're actually running tests that use Cucumber and Capybara, what does the software environment look like? So again, Cucumber is sort of if you want to think of it as a front end that reads your user stories, your scenarios, reads your step definitions, and one at a time, it tries to find a matching regular expression in a step def, runs that code as part of the user story, and we'll see how to write step definitions to essentially signal an error when something doesn't turn out the way that we expect. Cucumber relies on Capybara to actually simulate what the browser is doing. So it acts as an HTTP client. It maintains an internal representation of the DOM. It can examine and manipulate that representation and verify things about it. Capybara is making these requests through a Rails adapter called rack tests that is basically the glue that allows it to sort of seamlessly interact with your app. And this is all one process, right? This is going to become important in a moment. So there's rack and your Rails app. If you wanted to also test things that included JavaScript, there's something called a headless browser, which includes a JavaScript engine, all of the logic to allow JavaScript to inspect and manipulate the DOM. So if you have JavaScript code as part of your app, Capybara can correctly simulate that behavior as well. And then your app probably uses a database. Maybe it's using SQLite if you're just doing development. Maybe you're using something like MySQL or Postgres. But the key thing here is that this is all one process. Whereas another way that you can run Capybara is to say, fire up WebDriver, which basically will start a real live browser, and you can set it up so that you can actually see the browser open and it's like a very, very fast, invisible human manipulating the browser. The browser will actually be a real browser really communicating with your app. So in some sense, this is the most realistic thing that you can do because you can't do anything to the app except what the UI allows, right? In a moment, I'm going to show why. And by the way, if you've heard this called Selenium in the past, it's the same thing. What it used to be called Selenium is now called WebDriver. Later, we'll talk about the RSpec testing framework, which uses the same stack. But the thing that I want you to take away from this diagram, which we're going to see a couple of more times, this is all one process, right? So Cucumber, Capybara, all the way through your Rails app, and regardless of whether you're using a built-in database like SQLite or an external one like MySQL or Postgres, because this is all one process, things that you can do in Capybara steps are things that you can control the app directly. For example, I can make an active record call directly in my step definition to set up some content in the database as part of setting up the state of the world. Whereas if I'm using this right-hand stack where I'm running a real live browser that's external, that browser is communicating with a standalone deployment of my app, whether that deployment is on my same computer or whether it's in the cloud. This is a very different situation because now the only thing that Capybara will be able to do is exercise the app via its user interface, right? It will not be able to reach into the app in some sense and directly call active record methods or directly muck around with the session, things that you could do if you were in the same process. By the way, one of the reasons I recommend the Unix programming environment is because this notion of a process and what the process's addressable variables and state are is so fundamental. So we'll come back to this, but the takeaway here from Capybara is one way or another, it simulates actions in the browser and it allows you to programmatically inspect those results. And that's how we're going to do our when steps and our then steps.